Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can see and hear me. Just letting you know that we are going to be recording this session, and I believe everybody is given permission for that. My name is Sarah Champion. I am a Labour MP based in the north of England, and I'm also very proud to be the chair of the International Development Select Committee. Within months of taking on the role of IDC chair, the world witnessed the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of Black Lives Matters. This forced a long overdue reckoning around questions of racial injustice across societies and communities, and of course the aid sector. Questions within the aid and development sector about who holds power and how race and racism intersects with that are of course not new. But during my first year of chairing the committee, I watched discussions with the sector start to emerge and then, I'm sorry, quite frankly, appear to stall. My committee's report on racism in the aid sector came out as one of our earliest and most foundational inquiries that we still draw on. But also we wanted to make sure that the comments that we kept on hearing, really as an aside from frontline workers about the racism that they were facing within their own workplaces and broader than that, well, I couldn't ignore it, and so that's why we did our inquiry into racism. The IDC Racism Report sets out a series of challenges and recommendations to aid organisations and to the FCDO about how they work with partners, the stories they tell the UK public, and how they tackle racism in the sector. This webinar is an opportunity to hear from NGOs and FCDO on how this agenda is being advanced and the challenges that remain, with a particular focus on how they work with partners and what they're doing to genuinely shift power. Three of our speakers are from the initiative Pledge for Change 2030, an initiative by international NGO leaders convened by Adeso, the Nairobi-based humanitarian development organisation. Their pledge is to build a stronger aid ecosystem based on the principles of solidarity, humanity, self-determination and equality. And they are, and then our speakers that we have today are Degan. She's one of the two conveners of Pledge for Change. She is Executive Director of Adeso, as well as co-founder of the first Global South civil organisation network for local and national humanitarian agencies, the Network for Empowered Aid Response, NEAR. In 2003, she pioneered the first large-scale cash transfer in Somalia, and her advocacy for funding humanitarian funds to local actors helped spur the grand bargain, 25% commitment. Degan provided powerful evidence to the IDC inquiry on philosophy of aid, and so I'm very glad that she's here with us today. We also have Aleema Shivji. She is the Chief Impact Officer at Oxfam GP, and she's standing in for Danny, Oxfam GP CEO. Aleema is truly a passionate advocate about building a more inclusive, equitable world through fighting inequality and changing systems. She has over 20 years experience in the public and not-for-profit sector, with previous roles including senior positions at Comic Relief and at humanitarian organisations, Humanitarian and Inclusion. She was also a founding trustee of the START Network, which is a membership body and funder working to transform the humanitarian aid system. We also have Patrick Watt, the Chief Executive Officer for Christian Aid, and prior to this, he was Policy and Campaigns Director, responsible for leading Christian Aid's influencing and mobilisation and research and evidence in the UK and internationally on issues of economic, environmental and social justice. Patrick has widespread experience of working in development of humanitarian organisations, including Oxfam, Action Aid and Save the Children. He is committed to Christian Aid's strategy of using prophetic voice to confront injustice and of working with churches to achieve lasting change. We're also very pleased to have Jenny Bates from FCDO. Jenny is Director General for the Indo-Pacific at FCDO, where she is also the board sponsor for RACE. Prior to this, Jenny was the Director General Europe at FCDO, And previously she worked in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, dealing with EU negotiations, devolution and international trade as the Chief Economist and Director of Analysis. Welcome to all of our speakers and welcome to all of you watching. I'm going to hand over to our speakers now. Each speaker has been given about 5 minutes to talk briefly. Jenny, a little bit longer because we really want to hear what she's got to say, and she's the only FCDO speaker. Then we'll have 15 minutes, half an hour for questions, which I'll start. We have got a Q&A sort of chat, so if you could put your questions in there and we'll try and get through as many as we possibly can. I'd now like to hand over to the speakers, and Aleema, could I start with you, please?
Absolutely, and thanks so much, Sarah, for the warm welcome. Welcome everybody, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Pledge for Change itself, why Oxfam joined it, and some of the opportunities it presents. So at Oxfam, when we've looked at misconduct issues previously, we knew that the problem wasn't just about misconduct. It was really about power imbalances, colonial behaviors, and racism. And these are behaviors that show up within Oxfam and across the aid system, as came out in the inquiry. And what the Pledge for Change seeks to do is to address these power imbalances by going deep into what causes them and working really hard on transformative action. So at its heart, the Pledge for Change really reimagines the role of INGOs in the global humanitarian and development aid system through more equitable partnerships, more authentic storytelling, and influencing wider change. As Sarah mentioned, it was started by Degan and a few others, and I know Degan will speak more about that. And it really grew organically through informal conversations between dedicated leaders from both Global North and Global South civil society. And I think actually this real strength of Southern civil society in the Pledge is one of the reasons that we at Oxfam and I personally find the Pledge such a powerful initiative. Within the Pledge, we have a Global South advisory group who are there not only to walk this journey with us, but they're also there to hold us to account and to push us to go further, faster. This isn't just a group of INGOs sitting in a room discussing how we change things. Our Global South partners are there to remind us why this journey is so important so that we can work towards a stronger aid ecosystem based on 4 key principles: solidarity, humility, self-determination, and equality. And I've personally found it really inspiring and important to listen to the voices of our Southern colleagues. They're a reminder to all of us that the journey we are taking is deeply personal, and it's ultimately about community agency. The other thing about the Pledge is it's a collective. We are a group of peer international organizations as well, and people that are walking this journey of transformation together. And doing it together means we can share practices, ideas, and our frustrations as well. We really encourage each other. It's an incredibly supportive space, which is another real strength of the Pledge. So briefly coming back to the 3 pledges, we all know that communities benefit when organizations closest to them are in the driving seat. We also know that there are lots of barriers for local organizations in our aid and development system. And through this Pledge, we seek to build more equitable partnerships so that we can truly shift money, power, and decision-making closer to communities. And this goes beyond localization to a strong focus on encouraging a more resilient, independent, and diverse civil society, really valuing the leadership of national and local actors, and investing in making partners stronger and more sustainable so that local civil society can really flourish. We also aim to shift the dial on how we tell stories, putting local people at the heart of the story and changing the narrative to one of strength and opportunity. And I think at Oxfam, we see this as a real opportunity to build a narrative focused on solidarity, not aid, and engage with next-gen supporters who are wanting new ways to engage with us. And the third pledge is about influencing wider change. So I'm really glad we've got FCDO on the panel with us, because while there's a lot that we can change as INGOs, there are other things where we need others to step up to the plate. For us to achieve the first pledge on equitable partnerships, we need donors like FCDO to test and pilot and roll out new ways of working, make it easier to share ICR, move away from seeing local organizations as inherently risky and focus on the strengths and opportunities they present. I know that FCDO said they're looking at how their approach to NPAC, or their non-project attributable costs, could be extended to all their funding. And this is absolutely key. We hope this happens soon. And FCDO's commitment to the Equality Fund for Feminist Movements is also a great initiative. And we hope to see FCDO building on this initiative. It'd be amazing if you did, and I have no doubt that our Global South partners would be ready to help co-design something that works for them. And that leads me to my final point. No single initiative is going to enable us to truly center communities in both the issues that face them and the solutions they seek. I see it as a jigsaw, each piece being interlinked with another, whether it's the Charter for Change, the Grand Bargain, Reimagining INGOs, the Ringo Project, Bridgetown. Each of these elements is leading to change across the wider system, and we need each of these. Within this, the pledge brings a few unique elements: the strength of Southern civil society voice in shaping and holding us to account, the focus on storytelling, and the reach that goes beyond humanitarian right through to development assistance. So as I hand off to Patrick, I want to reiterate that the Pledge for Change is bold. The changes we need to make won't be easy, and we absolutely can't change alone. This is a journey we need to all take together, including the donors that fund us and the wider system around us. We are just one part of a big jigsaw.
And the next part of that jigsaw, thank you very much, Aleema, is Patrick. Over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Aleema. Very good to be here with everybody today. I think Aleema has set out really clearly why the Pledge for Change. I think perhaps from a Christian Aid perspective, the one thing I would add is that part of the appeal for us of the Pledge for Change, part of the reason that we decided to engage was that it brought together some unusual suspects. And it brought together some organizations that aren't necessarily associated always with being in the forefront of locally led response. So I think part of the strength is that you've got a group of mostly large INGO federations at different stages on the journey towards accountable, transparent, locally led aid, who have decided to be more accountable, be more transparent, commit themselves to a vision and an end goal. And for that work to straddle both the humanitarian and the development work that they do, and to include how they communicate to publics. So I think it does, as Aleema said, really kind of add to complement existing initiatives that are out there. And it, again, as Aleema said, it's part of a bigger puzzle. I think this kind of bigger puzzle, going back to Sarah's introduction, is how do we shift power and take the agency and knowledge of people living in poverty seriously, and see the work that we do as a complement and support to that, rather than the principal part in the struggle to end poverty. So I think the title of this session is, Are We Really Shifting Power in the Aid Sector? And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of what Christian Aid is doing in this area. And I wanted to pick out 4 things that we're doing at the moment that I think have been given additional impetus by the Pledge for Change. So the first is our partnership principles and policy. And partnership has always been integral to the Christian Aid model and approach. We see ourselves as one part of a wider cause-led movement for change. And in that sense, partnerships really underpin everything we do. But also as a faith-based organization, I mean, theologically, we see poverty as a symptom of broken relationships, and actually partnerships are one way of expressing what healthy, full relationships, mutual relationships look like. So articulating our partnership policy, which we refreshed recently, and rolling that out in the organization, applying that more consistently, has been a really key foundation for this work. I think a second thing that we've been seeking to do is to share overhead costs more consistently with all of our partners. So we have a policy of sharing all indirect cost recovery that we get from upstream donors 50-50 with our national and local partners, recognizing that, in the same way that we have to run an organization, so do they. And also providing overhead costs of 10% of the total value of our grants, where we're issuing grants from our unrestricted income to local partners. And as a result of those policies, we've actually increased 5-fold to £1.25 million the amount of overhead that we have channeled to local partners in the last 2 years. So I think important progress there. I think a third area, alongside sharing ICR and our partnership principles, is the decision to phase out of all direct implementation this year. So there are 4 countries, DRC, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, where we were doing some direct implementation for a variety of reasons, much of it with the UN, entirely in humanitarian response. We've decided to double down on our partnership approach, phase that work out. There are reasons to do with cost and complexity why we stopped that, but most fundamentally, we wanted to stop that work because we felt it was diverting from that investment in strong partnerships. And that will, of course, then increase the proportion of our funding going to local partners. It's currently at about 48%, so we would expect that to get a lot higher as a result of that phase out by March of next year. And then a fourth area is the work we're doing to involve communities directly in program design and accountability, and particularly the survivor and community-led response that we've been developing in Lebanon, Syria, Haiti, East Africa, Ukraine, which is really putting affected communities in the driving seat with kind of small sums of direct grants that they manage, they design the programs. We've managed, together with other members of the ACT Alliance, of which we're a part, particularly Dan Church Aid, our sister agency in Denmark, to move about $8 million last year on survivor and community-led response. And I think there's some really exciting evidence coming through about the impact that can be created where affected communities, who after all are the first and last responders in every humanitarian crisis, but are also the protagonists of the struggle to end poverty, putting them in the driving seat. The results are proving to be really promising. What I think is concerning from our point of view is that this is heavily reliant on voluntary funding. We're not yet seeing institutional funders coming behind this. So we're relying principally on appeal income that we get, both from direct Christian aid appeals and from the Disasters Emergency Committee. So those are 4 things we're doing. I think there are areas we need to go much further. I think the challenge laid down by the Pledge for Change for us to get better at dignified storytelling, dignified images in our communications is really important. We're in conversation with some of the other signatory agencies about how we can progress that agenda and learn from each other, create some metrics and benchmarks for progress. And I think also wanting to invest more in advocacy engagement with the wider sector. I mean, some of the people on this call today will have been at the Grand Bargain meeting in Geneva and will know that to put it kindly, the progress on those commitments has been very, very patchy. So I think there's still a huge challenge of how the sector at large, and particularly the big upstream funders, the UN and the official donors, can change their approach so that we see much more investment in locally led response, and we see investing in national and local civil society as an explicit policy goal in and of itself. So
Thank you very much. Degan, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Aleema and Patrick. I just want to give a little bit of background to some on the reason why we led the pledge process and why I feel like it's a bit different than other existing processes. One thing I have to say is that, you know, our experience has been long in trying to change the sector as a whole. And we led what became known as the localization movement during the World Humanitarian Summit. And it was Adeso who came up with the idea of having a commitment, a target of 20% by 2020 that later became the Grand Bargain target. And we were so elated when that target was actually accepted. And then we spent another 3 years sitting in a committee trying to figure out to define what is a local actor and what is as local as possible mean. And honestly, that entire process of negotiating on definitions was extremely demoralizing. And after 2 years of consensus building, where the Global South lobbied very, very heavily to ensure that Global South nationalized INGOs would not be classified as local organizations, that we would use definitions that are more in line with the Global South, what we think is a local organization, a genuine local organization. Our definitions after 2 years of negotiating were just thrown out the door overnight, and new definitions were swept in, led by the two co-chairs, completely undemocratic process. And so that left a really bad taste in my mouth. And that's when I decided I'm not going to engage anymore in any of these big international multilateral-led processes. And another example I had was I actually sat with Anne Street, then of CAFOD, and myself in Geneva. She said to me, Degan, what do Global South NGOs want from us to change? Instead of us talking about FCDO or USAID and targets, what can we do better as INGOs? And we came up with a list of 10 commitments, her and I, and they were far more radical. But then when it went to this negotiated process with hundreds of INGOs putting their hands into that definitions or that document, it became extremely watered down. And this is what is now called the Charter for Change. So this taught me a few lessons. One, that if you're going to have any kind of negotiated process, keep it small. That we cannot bring in 20, 40, 50, 100 INGOs into this process. And number two, that the intention and the purpose of it, we had to keep it rooted in Global South, that we can't have it be led by the Global North actors because they have a vested interest in the status quo. It's very, very difficult to do something that's quite radical and drastic. And they're just, the amount of pressure that CEOs face from their boards, from their senior leadership teams, from their country directors, from their donors, their back donors, whether it's FCDO, USAID, it's tremendous to keep the status quo the same. And so for me, it was important that whatever small group that we created had to be a group of like-minded, committed individuals, not agencies, but individuals that I knew were really serious about this process and that were really genuinely grappling with these issues. Some were more advanced than others. And so they were all handpicked because I felt that they had a genuine commitment to these issues. And those 5 original CEOs and their NGOs ended up later bringing on board their federations, such as Danny from Oxfam, Sophia, and Peter from CARE. And then later Christian Aid, Patrick joined us, which was amazing. And Gwen from Save the Children, and Rose from Plan. So those original CEOs were key to the process. And then once we had our 3 pledges, which it took us 3 years to negotiate on, and that was hard just with 5 INGOs. Can you imagine if we now expanded it to 10, 20? And then we said, okay, now we're opening up the doors to allow signatories to come in into this process. So I think that's what sets this apart from other existing processes. I feel like the intent and the desire of what the Charter for Change was and what it's become after everybody got their hands on it is very different. I think it's still an important document. I still think that we do need to have these various other initiatives. But I also, I'm also very skeptical and cynical about the grand bargain, and I don't think it will have much results. And I mean, it's been how many years? 7 years almost since it was launched in 2016. And I will say, are we shifting power? No, we have more rhetoric right now than real change and real action. And it's that frustration from us in the Global South that actually is propelling, I think, the pledge for change. And I've said this also several times, that it's great to have a pledge. It's great to have documents that are pretty progressive and radical, but the real demonstration, the real metrics of success is when we hold INGOs accountable to what they have pledged to. And I think that's also what will set this process apart, that we are going to develop some robust accountability mechanisms in place that is multifaceted. It's not only peer levels, INGOs holding each other accountable, but it's also the Global South holding them accountable. It's their partners in countries holding them accountable. All of that is currently now being developed, and we hope to be able to launch something around the accountability mechanism before the end of the year. So I think that's also where the real meat of the pledge is. The second, I think, difference, and I'll end here, is that I think we also need to understand that localization and shifting power, in my opinion, are still focused on the issues of transactions, about moving money. They're still focused on, okay, so it's still money, but how involved are the partners in the design of the proposal, in the design of the project, and how the community is involved? All very important. I'm not saying they're not important, but I think one of the things we have tried with the pledge is to intentionally use words like decolonization and say that the entire architecture is broken. And INGOs need to go back to their roots of being real civil society, real third sector. And that means that they have to be intentionally political. Localization and shifting the power, in my opinion, are apolitical processes. They're not intentionally political. Whereas decolonization is very, very political. And I would like to see INGOs venture beyond service delivery, beyond project implementation, to becoming real, to demonstrate real solidarity and allyship with the Global South by confronting their own back donors, by confronting the unjust and unequal multilateral global governance systems, whether it's the IMF and the World Bank and the trade and all these things that have put these countries, my countries, in the position that they are, where they even need aid. We need to be in a position where we talk about not having aid, where we need to be talking about how do we truly and genuinely lift these countries out of poverty so that they don't need Save the Children or Oxfam or even Adeso to provide basic services, that these services are provided by their governments as their duty bearers, and they have the revenues to do that. They're not saddled with just unrealistic debt. And they're not part of a global governance system that ensures that extraction is what they're good for. You take your raw materials, you take it to Europe, whether it's cocoa, and you take it to Switzerland, and Switzerland becomes the best chocolate producer in the world when they never grow any chocolate. So we need to stop being a source of extraction of raw materials and be and industrialize our countries and employ our people and lift them out of poverty in a genuine way with a more fair and equitable financing and global governance system. And that's, I think, what sets the pledge apart, in the sense that we are recognizing that architecture is broken, and we're intentionally saying, INGOs, this is what solidarity looks like. So I hope that we get to the point, and maybe not in the first 7 years, but maybe in the next phase of the pledge, we get to a point where, even though I'm very committed to not having a pledge, because I really believe by 2030 that we don't need to sustain these structures. I don't want to create another structure that needs funding and that needs to stay forever and sustain itself. I'm very, very opposed to those kinds of things. Grand Bargain Secretariat will be there for how many more years? I don't know. But those kinds of things is not what we should be doing. We should be, all of us, thinking about working ourselves out of a job, including the pledge. But I would like to see some progress towards that real solidarity.
Degan, I could listen to you all day. I just find you so inspiring. So thank you very much. I've written loads of notes and there's been lots of questions coming up, but you have answered one of them. There was a question about Charter for Change and what's the difference. So you've answered that most eloquently. Thank you. Jenny, tough act to follow, but over to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here. As was mentioned, so I'm the Director General Indo-Pacific. The bit that's not in my job title is I'm responsible for some of the development work in the ministry, particularly the issues around private sector growth and the funding that we provide on that side. And I'm also the board champion on race. And although we're not talking about the core of the FCDO in that issue in this panel. I just wanted to acknowledge that. So I was going to do three things. I was going to talk a little bit about the context and the strategic approach, how we see these issues from the department. Secondly, I'm going to talk a bit about some examples of practical things that we're doing, particularly through our programme structures. And thirdly, I was going to talk a bit about reform to our systems, picking up a bit some of the comments earlier that this is a complex challenge to try and get your arms around. If you think about how you're actually trying to drive change here, it needs to be beyond and deeper than specific programme activity. So in terms of the overall context, and has been set out by the other speakers, I mean, we very much recognise that traditional models of aid can sustain historic unequal power structures and can disempower the people that they are seeking to serve. We also acknowledge that while the donor community collectively has made commitments to localising aid, progress on this has been slow. And I'm sure that you've all seen the data on it. You can measure through different parameters, but very small shares of the £150 billion in ODA are reaching local development actors. It's in the low single-digit % as one way of measuring this. And we do agree that making this shift, more localisation, more genuine empowerment, shifting the power balance, as you were, is one of the most important challenges facing the aid sector. And I just really wanted to pick up one of the themes of Degan's points, which is this is systems-wide, this is systemic, so it's complex, and working out how the different bits of the ecosystem can actually drive change here is what makes it hard, and that's part of the complexity in this. It isn't something that's very easily amenable with a simple statement, but it's about how you actually get your arms around it and do it. So just to say a little bit about what is the FCDO's approach. So strategically, in our 2022 International Development Strategy, which was published, we affirmed that those who benefit from our work must have a voice in what we do and how we do it. And we talk about putting people first in the FCDO's approach. And we know that equitable partnerships with governments and other stakeholders, whether that's civil society, nobody's mentioned business yet, actually, but they are an important local part of the communities that we support. This is really important as part of our strategy. And Minister Mitchell this year has launched the campaign to reinvigorate UK leadership in international development, has emphasised as part of that we need to establish mutually accountable and balanced partnerships. So it's just a way of saying, as a strategic intent, I think we are aligned in the broad objective that we're seeking to achieve. The UK is a signatory to the Grand Bargain, and we're also signed up to the Good Humanitarian Donorship Principles. So we have that kind of framing. So second thing then, what are we doing about it? And we are a large organisation, 17,000 people operating globally with a multi-billion-pound budget. So I'm just going to give you a few examples to bring it to life of what are the real things that we're trying to do to address this issue. I'm going to give you, I think, 5, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the systems. So firstly, in the women and girls space, this is an example of something. We have a £38 million programme supporting women's rights organisations. Within that, grants provided via the Equality Fund support grassroots women's rights organisations to build capacity and resilience. We do that working on women's funds to base the grants on their own local knowledge. We use grassroots advocates to attend and meaningfully participate in the decision-making fora, and we're working with Gender Links, the Southern-based women's rights organisation, to do this. So an example of how we're really trying to involve local groups and organisations in the decisions around how funding is used. Another example in the broader space is our innovative partnership. We've got a 10-year Shifting the Power initiative with Comic Relief. This is about building the capacity of civil society organisations in Ghana, Zambia and Malawi. It's particularly trying to build local leadership by using local grant selection panels, offering organisations the opportunity to identify their own capacity development needs and matching funding with local resource mobilisation efforts. So again, it's getting into this space of thinking about how we make decisions around where programme funding is allocated. In the humanitarian space, and others have mentioned the START network, The UK is supporting the establishment of the START network and the Humanitarian Learning Academy, which is strengthening the leadership of national and country-based local actors. Excuse me, my lights have just gone off. We've supported this START fund in 5 country-based hubs in India, Pakistan, DRC, Guatemala, and in the Pacific. And we're enabling local and national organisations to access the funding, do capacity building support and risk finance. Another example around actually the work that we're doing in Ukraine, maybe not something that people have particularly focused on, but we are looking to include funding guidelines when we're thinking about reconstruction efforts that require lead organisations to pass indirect costs down to local downstream actors. And then lastly, in the emergency response space, just to give an example of the sort of work we're doing there, the UK was the 2nd largest contributor to the country-based pooled funds in 2022, providing £150 million, and we're the largest contributor since its conception. This is a structure that continues to be the largest direct source of funding for local and national partners on the front lines of emergency response. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is thinking about this in different areas of the department's activity, whether that's women and girls programming, humanitarian, even reconstruction activity. These are very different kinds of things that we do, but trying to apply that principle and that concept of meaningful localization through the organisation's work, rather than saying we need a programme on localisation, as it were, sort of picking up the theme that this really needs to be embedded in how you act as a donor and as a funder. The last piece that I just wanted to talk briefly about was reforming our systems, because coming back to the fact that this is a systems change challenge, what are we doing in FCDO more strategically around our systems? It's worth saying, and Sarah holds us to account on this, that we are accountable to the British taxpayer for how we allocate our funding, and we do need to ensure that we have clear lines of sight and accountability. And this is one of those dynamics that operates in this space that you have to find ways to navigate. But just to give a few examples, we are firstly delivering on our commitment to reduce bureaucracy. We're particularly focusing on streamlining our due diligence processes for smaller interventions and speeding up our approvals processes. Why does that matter? Well, some of the actors that we're working in and with, some of the partners, are those that find the complexity of engaging with our systems barriers to having a more localized approach. Another thing that we're doing is looking very much at our commercial tendering approach. This gets a bit technical, but it really matters. So we have created bidding opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as local in-country organisations. We have an SME advisory forum of both prime and subcontractors. And what we're doing here is really trying to build a broader base of partners that can work effectively with our commercial contracting systems, including locally in country. And we think this will be an important way of both driving up excellence and innovation. I have to say this is also about getting quality of outcome, but broadening the partnerships we can deliver. It was mentioned briefly at the beginning, but we're also doing work around dismantling harmful narratives. I think this is an important part of this agenda, so the FCDO is committed to that as an organisation, reviewing our own communication products, how we talk about issues. So, for example, that's not just what we do, but we're also working with partners where we fund to ensure that they are thinking about their narratives that they are using. So, for example, the organisations we work with via the Central UK Aid Match programme are required to follow the principles of the narrative project to try and overcome outdated stereotypes. So this is about the department thinking about how it's working with partners and the kind of narratives and communication. And we're very conscious that, you know, we have a significant role in that. And then lastly, we are reviewing our approach to our central support for civil society and thinking about how we can align that even more in support of democratic resilience, reducing bureaucracy and patient locally led development. So those are the different ways that we're trying to think about how to advance progress on this complex and system-wide agenda. I just wanted to very briefly say at the end, as the race champion, it's not the focus, I know, of this discussion, but we also have commitments in the organisation about our own representation and diversity, and making sure that we are bringing the full breadth and depth of British diversity to our own staffing. And we have commitments in terms of supporting our staff overseas, but also increasing diversity on many metrics, but including on race, because we're very mindful that we need to fully represent the breadth of UK diversity and how we present into discussions. Not the focus of today, but an important part of what we're doing. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in this space. I have got more questions than time, so I would try and get through as many as possible, and I'll probably be merging some together. But if I can say to the panelists, I think you can type your responses if there are particular ones that you want to respond to. Could I start with Degan, though, please? I was really interested about you talking about decolonization and that needed to, I think you use the phrase that in organizations, NGOs, need to be intentionally political. I really like that phrase, being a politician. But I was also minded that the 5 organizations that you set up your agenda with were the 5 that I would say probably in the UK are the most political in their engagement and in their advocacy. So I wonder, how has it been working with the broader aid sector? I'm very minded that they use the language, but are you actually seeing the shifts that you need to see within their policies and distribution of support?
Yeah, so I think there's a limit to the political nature of the INGOs, and sometimes we use this issue of neutrality and the code of conduct as a get out of jail free card, where we just say that we are a civil society, we're not allowed to be political. But I think NGOs make political decisions every day in how they operate in countries. When you decide to operate in government-held areas in Syria and not in rebel-held areas in Syria, or vice versa, that's a political decision. So I think that this idea of neutrality and impartiality, and sometimes that's used also as a stick to say why we can't localize. There was a very interesting report issued by MSF years ago about how localization was not possible because of neutrality. I have real issues with that, because the assumption is that that you're only neutral if you're a white person from the global north who comes into this context. When I have seen with my own eyes INGOs who come into Somalia and work in one clan area for years and have employed one clan group, or in the case of Kenya, one tribe, and they dominate every single thing that that organization does. So this idea of neutrality doesn't really exist for any human beings. It's a very difficult concept to do. So have we seen any kind of real shift in this area? No, we haven't. And that's the reason why we worked really, really hard in negotiating on the language of the preamble. That took us a long time for the Pledge for Change to just articulate these issues and be intentional in articulating the political nature of the aid system. And what would I like the INGOs to do that is more political? There was a great report issued by Oxfam just recently. I haven't finished reading it, but it was talking about how IMF and World Bank policies that have been intentionally trying to ensure that African countries, instead of investing in public healthcare systems, they have been pushing them for the past 20, 30 years to privatize the healthcare system. As a result of privatizing the healthcare system, instead of in the North, we say it's a human right. In America, they're doing every single thing possible to get Medicare for all passed. In Europe, it's one of the things that's lauded is the social safety nets that exist. But when we come to our countries, we're told, demolish all your social safety systems. Make sure you don't give free education. If you want a World Bank loan, you can't do that. If you want a structural adjustment agreement, if you want to renegotiate your debt, you have to stop giving services to your citizens and cut every single thing. And then, and that has real human life consequences. And they were just talking about mortality rates having decreased, just real life examples of children dying who couldn't get access to services because they just can't afford it. It's one of the things. I live in Kenya and I've been here for 20 something years, and I can see it with my own eyes with the people in my network. And so, so these are the real life consequences of these kinds of things. And it's very rare that this is not the kind of things we see many INGOs talk about or push their governments to say, hey, why is there only 5 countries who have veto power in the UN? Why can't, we're never resolving Syria, we're not resolving Ukraine, we're not resolving massive conflicts in the world because of this issue of veto power. And you come to our countries and you demand democracy. You say you have to have good governance. You push this down our throat and put billions of dollars into good governance programs. But then here, every single thing that we have seen established by the global North has been undemocratic. It's not one country, one vote when it comes to the World Bank and the IMF in terms of the membership. It's same thing with the UN, veto power for only 5 countries. This is something that we're supposed to be sharing as the world, as humanity, these institutions, but that's not the case. So these are the things that I would like to see more INGOs talk about and pressure their countries. I mean, wouldn't it be great if all the major UK NGOs who are part of the DEC actually had a position and went to the UK government and said, we want you to support relinquishing your veto power as just a gesture to the global South to say that this is wrong, that we have veto power. Would that not be powerful? That would be amazing to see civil society in the UK mobilize around that.
It would be indeed incredible to see, and much welcome from my point of view. Can I just push you a little bit on that last point? I was very struck by evidence we had from a young woman from Afghanistan who said the global North goes in and puts in what it believes to be democracy and needed, and then calls it aid, rather than what is actually needed by civil society and the people on the ground. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, we have so many white elephants of projects and things that were not needed. There are so many documented projects from the tsunami response in 2004. Yeah, I mean, I will just say that as a pioneer of cash transfers, Adeso, one of the things we're known for is contributing to the global acceptance of cash. But it's one of the things now that I regret, because what I've seen is that the aid community has a habit of doing things in a very lazy way. And we see communities in the south of Somalia who experienced the 2011 famine and left their farms, now in permanent IDP camps in Mogadishu, in the capital, receiving uncoordinated, completely inefficient cash transfers. So WFP is giving a transfer, another INGO X is giving a transfer, INGO Y is giving a transfer, even probably Adeso would have given a transfer, and there's no central registry, there's no nothing, and we're actually promoting people to stay and not going back to their farms, to the productive sector. Somalia used to be a net exporter of food. Now we are net importer of food. And when you have things like Ukraine and the food prices go up, fuel prices go up, there's no real effort to make Somalia go back to food sovereignty. There should be a massive effort to say, we have all this arable land, we need to get people back to farming. How do we do that? Rather, all the aid programs are about these short-term, inefficient, dependency-causing cash transfers that are not really addressing the root cause and just creating permanent dependency. So yeah, I see that we do sometimes far more harm than good.
Powerfully said. Jenny, could I bring you in here? There's a question which I think summarises what some of the other questions towards you are. So the question is, we've seen some donors take concrete steps, for example, setting goals for consulting with local civil society or creating funding targets, such as in the case of USAID's 25% commitment. So the question is, will FCDO be making any similar specific measurable commitments and targets for increasing their support for locally led development to back up their policy statements and isolated programs in this field?
Thanks, Sarah. I think the way I would start by answering this is sort of where I started on. We're a complex organisation, 17,000 people spending multi-billion pounds of British money across the system, some of it directly ourselves, some of it through partners, some of it leveraged through the multilateral system, some of it investing in businesses, some of it investing in civil society, some of it partnering with other donors. We have a very complex landscape of what our funding is doing. And we also, I think, are approaching this more in a systems leadership way, that you set a clear direction of what it is that you're trying to do and then work out the best way to achieve that in terms of impact and effectiveness. I think there would be, to be honest with you, I think there's some degree of scepticism. There are lots of targets loaded into the aid sector on different things, whether that's on overall targets, climate finance targets, new objectives that are built into the system. And even if you do that, the much more challenging question is how you operationalise this, to be honest. And that's what I was trying to talk about in terms of the examples of the programming, because you have to manage, in the end, doing this in a way that achieves value and outcome. And what we're trying to do is build capacity in country and work with partners so that we have a much stronger and richer ecosystem of partners that we can do this with in a way that achieves the goals that we're seeking to achieve. So I think there is a degree of questioning around whether setting a target is the right way, or indeed in and of itself going to be necessary and sufficient to get to the kind of complex change that Degan was talking about, and that I think we see, particularly given that not all of our instruments are involved working necessarily with civil society. Some of them work with other partners, as I mentioned, businesses or other actors. So I think we approach life and thinking it's a quite complicated thing that we're trying to do. It's a clear direction of travel and then working out how you achieve it indirectly. And maybe just to pick up a little bit what Degan was saying about reform of the wider international system, we are FCDO, and so we have a big process and focus on reform of the multilateral system that goes wider than the development space. I think there's an interesting question perhaps for this group, which is, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Because there's a broader question about reform of the UN and the wider global power structures. Thanks.
Jenny, because of time, thank you for your question, but we're putting questions to you. So could I ask you another one, if you're still there? Your camera's gone off, which is you speak about, in answer to that question, you speak about sort of changing and leading in a systems leadership way. So two very specific questions. How are you increasing diversity within FCDO? Because we only know what we know. And you spoke about giving local people a voice. A voice could just be a consultation that doesn't get listened to. A vote or leading is a much more proactive and direct way to get local people at a seat at the table. So could you comment on both of those points, please?
Thanks, and I'll try and be brief because I'm conscious of time. So on the voice point, it is more than consultation in the examples that I have talked about. So the piece that I would draw out there is decision making around what and how we're allocating funding. I'm not sure that quite counts as a vote, but involved in participation in decision making, not simply asking for opinions. And I think that that's an important part of the shift that we need to move through. On increasing diversity, we have done great strides in the department on gender in recent times, though we still have an ambition to increase at senior level, but we've had great track record in increasing the number of women we have as ambassadors and senior leaders. What we've recently adopted is a new target on racial diversity for our UK-based staff, bearing in mind that we have country-based staff who are hired from all sorts of communities, in line with the economically active population in the UK. So to have a benchmark of that, and we are taking a series of steps around sponsorship, promotion and progression. It's essentially a challenge for us at senior levels. So we're working to increase diversity at the senior levels in the organisation.
Thank you very much. Aleema, could I come to you? You spoke about solidarity, not aid, and you also spoke about equitable aid. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what you mean by that, because they're great phrases, but what's underpinning that? And then could you give some concrete examples from Oxfam about how that's actually being implemented?
Absolutely. So I think the starting point for me is acknowledging, and I think this picks up with some of the other questions that are coming up around acknowledging our colonial roots as organizations. The international aid architecture comes from a colonial system and a period of slavery, and the ensuing attitudes, behaviors and actions from that space. So I think first of all, it's acknowledging that that's our history, because in order to move forward and progress and do something differently, you need to know where you've come from. So I think really acknowledging that part of our history. And in that history, there's a white saviorism element in it. There's a giving to others, doing to others. And I guess when I think about solidarity, it's about how do we bring everybody all together? So we're thinking about us, not them. We're all one humanity. And I think, Degan, you spoke also about one, we're one humanity. For me, that's sort of the starting point. And if we think about us in a more equitable way that way, we're really looking at what does everybody bring to the table? What are the assets that people bring to the table? And maybe a couple of examples. So first on the sort of solidarity piece, some of the work that Oxfam has been doing has been changing the way that we tell stories. So here in the UK, if I think about some of the messaging that we had around the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine crisis, really centering our local partners in the messaging, them speaking in their own voices about things that were important to them. As an example of changing the mindset, we're looking at the imagery we use, how we capture content. So that's some of the things that we're doing to really think about how do we shift the narrative of what we're trying to say, who designs the narrative that we're putting out, what are we trying to say? I think on the equitable partnership side, some of the things that we've been doing, so we're really pleased one of our donors, it's not FCDO unfortunately, but one of our other donors has agreed to do a pilot of ICR sharing with us, because as I mentioned, ICR sharing, often the barrier isn't the INGO, it's the rules of the back donors. So we've got one of our INGOs, we've had them commit to do an ICR sharing pilot with us. We are also piloting support directly to women's rights organizations with core funding. So taking away projectized money, providing core funding to local women's rights organizations so that they can decide how to use the money in a way that's relevant to them. And as we scale the fund, we're looking at how we can involve those in the first round to help us co-design a new governance mechanism. How do we actually determine which women's rights organizations get the money? Should that be Oxfam? Probably not. And it most definitely, already it isn't Oxfam outside of a country. It's our colleagues in country that have that local knowledge and local understanding and local relationships. So those are a couple of the concrete examples.
Thank you very much. Patrick, could I bring you in? And can I just apologise to everyone watching this? We are running out of time, and I know there's so many questions that you want to answer. But again, if I could direct panelists, if you are able to answer any of those directly, that would be fab. Patrick, you caused a lot of questions to ping up when you were talking about shifting away from direct implementation. I wonder if you could link that to another, I summarised the question, but it says, in their effort to decolonize, several INGOs are registering their country programmes as local NGOs. National NGOs see this move as taking their space and accessing local funds. So could you clarify what you think is behind country offices, independent so can you clarify what is the thinking behind making country offices independent entities with a decolonization lens? Sorry, I'm merging two questions.
No, that's fine.
That shouldn't necessarily be, but I want to get you in.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think different organizations have different approaches to this. I mean, because we're a partner-based organization, our country offices are very small. They're entirely staffed by people from those countries. We've got a couple of exceptions. We have an Indian national leading our team in Kabul and an Indian national leading our team in Yangon in Myanmar, of the countries in which they work. And because they're partner-based, they're small teams. I mean, I think there's an interesting question for NGOs based in the global north about whether a bricks and mortar presence in the countries in which they work is necessary or desirable, and whether there are other models. I mean, you know, we do have entirely remote programs in some parts of the world. So our Middle East program is entirely remote. Partners in the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Syria, in northwest Syria, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, who do the, you know, they do all the work. I mean, we fund that work from Christian Aid in the UK. Now, I mean, some people might argue, well, that in itself feels kind of, you know, potentially a bit hub and spoke, and is that a decolonized model? So I think you can kind of argue the debate both ways, but I think I think there is a danger with setting up national entities of international NGOs, if you go about it in the wrong way, that you cannibalize the space for national civil society. I think there is a difference between where INGO federations are diversifying by bringing into their networks pre-existing national civil society organizations, as opposed to setting up, if you like, local branches. I think the local branch approach is much more problematic in my view. I think there are, you know, arguments that could be made for actually diversifying INGO federations so that they're less dominated by European and North American members, and one way of doing that might be to incorporate into those networks national civil society organizations.
Thank you very much. Scanning through the questions, that they're all brilliant, and I wish we had an hour just to do this, or maybe 2 or 3, to be quite honest, because I always find these things so thought-provoking. What I would say to people is, do look at the questions if you can, and I would like to thank all of you for listening. I particularly want to thank all of the speakers for sharing your thoughts, and also to Christian Aid for coordinating all of this. What I would say is there's clearly a lot of appetite to continue not just discussing this, but actually implementing the changes that we need to see. So anything we can do to reconvene and keep on fighting in this space is certainly something I'm up for, and I'm imagining by the questions you are up for. I'm just going to end with one question which has particularly caught my imagination, and it's a thought for all of us as we lead, which is, shouldn't we stop calling ourselves the aid sector? Doesn't that word aid imply post-colonial political relationship? Should we use new language, for example, the international solidarity sector? So in solidarity, thank you to all of you for all that you do on a daily basis. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your time, and please keep in touch. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye all.